I want to welcome my friend Paul Street to the RNL show. Paul is a historian and he's a member of the editorial board of Refuse Fascism. He has a Substack, Paul Street Report, and he writes for Counterpunch. Paul, welcome to the RNL show.
Thanks a lot, Andy. How you doing?
I'm doing good. So, Paul, you wrote an article that first appeared on your Substack blog and then on Counterpunch titled Ukraine War Reflections. And you identified 9 arguments with a movement that thinks of itself as progressive and even radical, even a left. And yet you describe this as a shattered and lame U.S. left whose arguments are darkly comedic. And we published your piece on revcom.us. So I want to start with asking you, why did you write this piece? What provoked you?
Well, first of all, it is absolutely my responsibility, our responsibility here in the United States, above all, to take aim at and criticize our own national capitalist imperialist power. I think you lose credibility if you don't acknowledge from the beginning that, yes, Putin is a butcher. Yes, Russia has a neo-fascist regime. Yes, Russia committed atrocities in Bucha and elsewhere. Yes, Putin's invasion is criminal. Yes, Putin did not have to go to war. He was provoked, but he was not compelled to. He was not forced to go to war. You get that out of the way, and that's true. But I don't live in Russia. Russians need to deal with that. Marxists here, socialists here need to be reaching out to socialists and Marxists and peace-oriented human beings in Russia. And Russians need to be forming a movement against their own capitalist imperialist country. We're here in the United States of America, which happens to be the number one top imperialist aggressor state, not only in the world, but in world history. And as bad as what the Russians are doing, and incidentally, what they're doing is on their own very directly proximate geographic border that has been invaded repeatedly by the West with millions of deaths, Napoleon, Hitler, coming through Ukraine, coming through Eastern Europe. I mean, think about the geographic inversion. What would the United States be doing if Russia or China were involved in a military alliance with Mexico or Canada, directly on our borders, But so it's here, and nothing Russia has done, as awful as what Russia is doing, and it is criminal, and it is horrible, and Putin belongs behind bars, absolutely. But this does not compare in scale to what the United States has done in Iraq, to what the United States has done in Afghanistan, what the United States did historically in Central America and in Southeast Asia. There is no bigger, more crass and cynical violator of international law than the United States of America. It is the number one imperialist aggressor state, and therefore has no moral or legal ground to stand on, really, seriously. And this is understood around the global South. It's completely understood across most of the world that the United States has no ground whatsoever to stand on in accusing people of breaking international law. It's exactly what it has done. Joe Biden himself led the cheers on the Democratic side of the U.S. Senate in 2002 for the use of force authorization to let George W. Bush invade Iraq illegally and on false pretenses if he wanted to. And guess what? He did. And millions died.
You decimate and this is related, the position of what you call national U.S. chauvinism, I believe, but it's that the U.S. is defending Ukraine's right to self-determination, a claim that is bound up with Biden's characterization of this war as a war for democracy against Putin's autocracy. So I'd like you to speak a little bit about this, not just in terms of the left, but though they do completely take up these terms of democracy, but its effect more broadly on the masses of people here.
Well, I think in a lot of complex historical situations, and this is a doozy, as I say it as a historian, there's a lot of things going on at the same time. There is, at some level, there's a legitimate struggle for self-determination by the Ukrainian people. They have, in fact, been illegally and criminally invaded. There's a Russian imperial objective that, in some ways, in some really out of whack hyperbole, Putin announced on the day of his invasion. There's imperial objectives there and material class interests on the part of Russian oligarchs, and all of this. But the United States moved very quickly. I would say really almost from the outset, to leap onto the Ukrainian cause to make something much more out of it. And they said it. They said the quiet part out loud. The leading general, the leading commander, Austin, was in Poland and said flat out at a press conference that we hope to weaken Russia. We hope to weaken Russia. Biden himself, some say it was a slip up, was heard in Poland early on to say that Putin should no longer stand can no longer be the leader of Russia, which, sounded kind of regime changing. And that's certainly how people around much of the rest of the world must have understood it. So it went way beyond defending Ukrainian right to self-determination and very quickly became something that was very much about an inter-imperial geopolitical conflict with a perceived imperial rival, which, by the way, is fighting on its own direct southwestern border, right? Which is no one ever seems to want to talk about. And like in the U.S. invasion of Iraq, it was necessary to have a whole propaganda ideological framework and set in place to justify this provocation. And we don't have all the time to do all the history, but the U.S. and NATO have been provoking Russia, what's called poking the bear, ever since the fall, well, and even before the end of the Soviet Empire. And so they say this is and you see parts of the left playing along with this rhetoric that this is a great struggle between democracy, represented by the Ukrainians and supposedly the West and the U.S., and autocracy and authoritarianism represented by Russia. Well, there's no doubt whatsoever that Russia is an autocratic, right-wing, authoritarian, even in its own kind of way, a Christian white nationalist state. It's horrific. It's some argue, like Jason Stanley, that Putin is a neo-fascist. Okay, so that's true. But what about the U.S.? What, democracy? This is an open plutocracy sliding in to neo-fascism. It's a failing bourgeois democracy where majority public opinion is irrelevant and trumped and defeated again and again on one issue after another. What? We're the friends of democracy, and we're also the key sponsor and ally and funder and equipper and trainer and overseer of the Judeo-fascist state of Israel and its occupation of Palestine, of the open absolutist beheader regime in Saudi Arabia, of the dictatorship in Egypt. We are on the side of a right-wing neo-fascist type of coup in Peru right now. We have a history of backing third world fascist regimes, dozens of them over many decades.
Well, it's important that people understand the actual reality on the one hand and also understand the batch of lies and propaganda that they are fed. In fact, Avakian wrote right after the start of the war, I believe in April of last year, of 2022, quoting the famous saying that the first casualty of war is the truth. But I'd like to talk, in conclusion, or as a last main question here, about the stakes of this war and the dangerous head in the sand approach that too many people in this country have. You know, I guess we probably both grew up with Alfred E. Newman's infamous motto of "What me worry."
What me worry? I don't even care. What me worry? Worrying can't get you anywhere.
So perfect for America and an American so-called left who's fatted on the spoils of imperialism. You wrote that a bunch of people, including no small number of left supporters of Ukraine on the one side and Russia on the other. Now, you use more colorful language, but on the one hand, these two sides are starting to remind you of Slim Pickens playing Major Kong at the end of Dr. Strangelove. So your thoughts about that? Paul?
It is just astonishing. I have heard from numerous people who are left identified and consider themselves socialists, whatever they mean by that, that really the risk of World War III coming from this is low, unlikely. That has been said to me repeatedly. It's unlikely. It probably won't happen. And it sort of raises this sort of basic question of, did you see that the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists just put the clock closer to midnight? The closest it's ever been in history. How do you just discount that? And this raises this other question of what is an acceptable level of risk of World War III? I mean, really, what, 5%? 10%. So would you like to play Russian roulette? It's just insane to me. It only takes one World War III to create a nuclear winter and end life on Earth. It's just madness. And Biden himself said, we're looking possibly at Armageddon. The New York Times last Sunday had a really interesting piece. I think it was by Roger Cohen, longtime European correspondent. This thing is looking like it's going to just go into a multi-year slog, with the bodies just piling higher and higher. And Putin and his pit bull Medvedev and others saying flat out, we will not tolerate a decisive victory on their own on our own borders. And so what? And then the people on the left tell me, well, they're bluffing. They don't really mean it. Really? Okay. Let's find out if that's true. And, because Zelensky runs to these capitals, and there's this dance going on. You had a section on this show a while back about this, where, he jumps around and begs he wants tanks. No, we don't have tanks. Okay, give him tanks. Oh, he wants this. He wants this military hardware, and he wants these defensive missiles. He wants this. Now, freaking Biden has actually popped up in Kiev itself. How provocative is that? Imagine Xi Jinping or Putin showing up in Mexico City, as part of a military alliance and during a war between Mexico and the United States of America, and probably F-16s seem inevitable at some point. Then maybe a no-fly zone. It just gets worse and worse and worse, and nobody can give in and nobody can back down, and these things take on a life of their own. It's just madness to pretend that.
I think we have to bring out the biggest problem we face right now is that the interests of the masses of people of the world are not on the stage. And until the interests of the masses of people are on the stage, where people in this country and other countries are acting against this war and demanding it stop, the choices will appear to people as between these two sides. And see, this is part of the crime of these fucking leftists, okay? This is the crime, and it's not the first time a left has done this, where they take the side of one or the other bourgeoisie and they leave the masses choosing between two murderous entities instead of getting out there themselves, yes, at risk, and standing up and saying, no, this war has to stop. Now, we believe, as revolutionary communists, RevComs, that this opens up the possibility of a necessity for a revolution to replace a system that would even do such a thing. And this is very important, because otherwise it is just talk. And their talk is talk that's leading to the status quo. And Vakin has made this point for years. The politics of the possible is a politics of monstrosity. And we are seeing that right now on a world scale level. And we have to act to stop this. I think this is very important in terms of what sits before us and why people need to understand the terms of this, and they need to understand that those who would pretend to be progressive and say, well, you shouldn't give the money for war, you should give the money for jobs, that's actually has nothing to do with the nature of imperialism, and it leaves people paralyzed. It leaves them paralyzed to actually act in their own interests, which are absolutely opposed to this whole system.
Well, yeah, and I want to second all of that. I want to add something, which is I'm hearing people left identified, making the analogy between when Indonesia genocidally, and with U.S. green light, by the way, invaded East Timor. Wrong analogy. This is a very different sort of historical circumstances. You want the best one that I can think of, potentially, is a Cuban Missile Crisis. Which is when the midnight clock really was the closest that it ever was. And I would really like people to study that and look back on some of the literature and look up the histories of the Cuban Missile Crisis, because it did get out of control. It's almost a miracle. My father told me this, people were calling each other up on the telephone and saying goodbye with some very good reasons. But for the decision of one Soviet sub-commander to oppose the decision of a higher up commander to go ahead and use a tactical nuclear weapon in the Saragossa Sea in the South Atlantic on Black Saturday in October of 1962, we wouldn't even be here talking about any of this. These things can escalate out of control like that. The Slim Pickens analogy I was making was from the movie that was so popular called Dr. Strangelove that helped drive the rise of the New Left to some extent in the 1960s, which depicted precisely such a situation.
Hey, what about Major Kong?
Well, look, I think that's actually a good place to end. So, Paul, I want to thank you again for being on the RNL Revolution Nothing Less show and for continuing to write columns that get up on Counterpunch, as well as your own Substack blog and report that makes a big difference. And we've got to get out there and organize more people to get into more platforms where we can start fighting for the truth. And that's going to involve putting some bodies on the line and getting out there and fighting against this war and for the interests of humanity. So thank you for being on the RNL show.
Hey, thanks for having me, Andy. Great to talk.
Okay.